Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to those of you on the East Coast. My name is Paul Yock. I'm the director of the Stanford Byers Center for Biodesign, and I'd like to welcome you to this first Innovators Workbench of the year. We're delighted to have Scott Gottlieb with us, and we'll be welcoming him shortly. Also, as you've probably noticed, this session is dedicated to the memory of Tracy Lefteroff. More about that in just a moment. This is our 20th year of Biodesign, and we're looking forward to a few special events as the year unfolds. I want to specifically mention our next Innovators Workbench on March 3rd, which will feature Erica Rogers, Leslie Trigg, and Bess Weatherman discussing the leadership of two of the most exciting and significant medtech IPOs of this past year, Silk Road and Outset Medical. Today's program is co-organized by Fogarty Innovation as part of an ongoing and building collaboration between our two programs. So let me turn things over for a bit to Andrew Cleland, the CEO of Fogarty Innovation.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Tom and the Fogarty Innovation team, we're honored to co-host today's Lefteroff lecture and to welcome you all to what I believe will be an important and informative discussion with Dr. Gottlieb. As you're all well aware, events of this quality don't just happen. They reflect the hard work of many folks. On behalf of Paul and myself, I would like to acknowledge the efforts of CC Torres and Stacy McCutcheon for marketing and artwork, Kathleen Soshin and Angie Kirshner for the AV and IT, and lastly, Annette Uwanich for bringing it all together. Thank you all and great work. Some of you may have noticed the change in our name. This was to acknowledge the growth of our organization and of our vision. Really appreciate you taking the opportunity to visit our new website. We'd love to have you help us shape the future of human health. Finally, I'd like to thank you all for what you do on a daily basis. This last year has been tough, and we have a few more tough months to go, but I'm truly proud of what we as a community offer to our society. We're a community based on helping others, and in times like these, the simple act of helping each other is powerful. Thank you, and back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Andrew. From our very first session years ago, Innovators Workbench series has been sponsored by Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, with Casey McGlynn making it all happen. I know I don't need to introduce Casey any further here. I think he's the one person in medtech that everybody on this podcast knows already, but we did ask Casey to make a brief reflection on his friend and colleague, Tracy Lefteroff. Casey?
Yes, thank you. So today's Innovator Workbench talk with Scott Gottlieb is sponsored by the Lefteroff program at Fogarty Innovation. And that program was formed in 2013 in memory of the late Tracy Lefteroff, an early Fogarty Innovation board member and the global PwC managing partner who focused much of his career on the medical device industry and the venture capital community that supported it. When Tracy died suddenly in 2013, a group of individuals and companies from the biomedical industry made a donation to the Fogarty Institute in Tracy's memory, and the Lefteroff program was born. One of its annual events, of course, is this Stanford Biodesign Innovators Workbench speaker program. I want to just reflect that I worked extensively with Tracy on so many projects over the years, and I'm sure that many of you in the audience remember Tracy and all the things he did to help young companies succeed, whether it be introductions to venture capitalists or really just strategy sessions with regard to various other things. He was always there to help in any way he could. With that background, let me turn this meeting back over to Paul Yock, who will introduce Scott Gottlieb and our moderator, David Kassick. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Casey. So let's get going with the program. And now let me turn things over to our ACE moderator, David Kassick. David's co-editor-in-chief and managing partner of MedTech Strategist, and he will introduce Scott.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'm so delighted to be here at the first of the Innovators Workbench. It's a great series, and Scott, as Paul mentioned, we're delighted to have you here and grateful to you for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us tonight. I suspect that most of the people who are listening in on this cast know you as the former FDA commissioner and as the person they see in so many television news broadcasts and read about in print, informing us, keeping the country informed about what's going on with the pandemic. I don't know how many people know that you actually have a much more a varied and diversified career, and that a couple of decades ago, you were actually one of the most influential figures in the biotech industry. So I wonder if you could begin by just talking to us a little bit about your experience in biotech. What were you doing back then, and what led you to make that move from a practicing physician to a figure in the biotech industry?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm not sure I was a very big figure in the biotech industry, but I could talk a little bit about the arc of my career, if that's helpful, and what I did in biotech early on. I started after college. I started as an investment banking analyst at Alex Brown in their healthcare group back in this was sort of the mid '90s, when biotech was really starting to accelerate, when there was a lot of activity in the equity markets. We actually were doing a lot of healthcare services work at that time as well. There were a lot of practice management companies going public. We backed Vicor and Med Partners, for those who remember those companies. And from there, I went to medical school. And I went to medical school at Mount Sinai and did residency in internal medicine at Mount Sinai. But all through medical school, I was writing a lot about health policy, and writing with a pretty consistent point of view, sort of a right of center point of view. I was getting published pretty prominently. I was fortunate to be able to find my way into the Wall Street Journal. I was getting published pretty regularly there, in USA Today, and a little bit in the New York Times on the editorial pages, writing about sort of healthcare reform and healthcare issues from the perspective of a medical student or of a resident. So I was sort of drawing off what I felt was a unique perspective and trying to opine on larger issues. And I was also, I got some editorial positions on the British Medical Journal and the Journal of the American Medical Association. So those became really good platforms. And writing a lot about healthcare, I started to then work with George Gilder, who was a futurist at the time, writing the Gilder Technology Report. And I worked with him to launch the Gilder Biotech Report, and I wrote it. And so I was writing about the biotech industry from that platform, which at the time was a pretty prominent platform. George was very heavily engaged in sort of commenting on and trying to predict the future of the evolution in the internet and in technology, and made a lot of very good calls that over time turned out to be very right. So a lot of thoughtful people followed closely what he said. So having the ability to write from from his perch and be the author of the report that he was putting out on biotech was gave me a really good window into the industry and good access. After residency, I started practicing medicine as a hospitalist, but I also was offered a position at the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank down in Washington, pretty prominent right of center think tank, to be a fellow there, which at the time was a big deal. I was the youngest person ever to be hired as a full fellow at the think tank. Took the offer. I was actually at the time contemplating doing a fellowship in gastroenterology, and ended up not doing that. Ended up practicing as a hospitalist and moved down to Washington to work at the think tank. I always joke that, when I was FDA deputy commissioner, if I had done that fellowship in gastroenterology, I would have been doing colonoscopies in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, probably, instead of being FDA deputy commissioner. So it's just funny how things turn out differently. But just my heart wasn't in it anymore. And so I went down to Washington, was doing health policy work off of that platform for about a year, writing a lot about FDA related regulatory issues, which I had gotten involved in opining on and analyzing when I was working with George and writing for the Wall Street Journal as well. And I was,
so to your mind, how did your work in public policy, or I should reverse this, how did your work as an analyst in the biotech industry influence or affect your views on public policy? Did you see them as two kind of separate spheres, or was your work as a biotech analyst influential in the public policy path that your career took?
Yeah, I mean, look, working in the industry definitely gave me sort of an awareness and appreciation for the market related issues, and I think it sort of informed my more libertarian type of leanings. I think where that became very important though is when I was in public policy, when I was serving at the FDA. So just to sort of finish the story, when I was at the AEI, Mark McCullen was coming aboard to be FDA commissioner, asked me to come aboard and be a senior advisor to him at FDA. And I actually struggled with the decision, which in retrospect looks like a crazy thing that I would have turned down an opportunity. Developed a very good working relationship with Mark. When he went to go run Medicare, Medicaid, I went with him. And then I went back to FDA's deputy commissioner with his help. So Mark really made my career. So, the way I think about it is the writing really gave me the opportunity to be recognized. And then Mark sort of found me and really made my career. I think the work that I did in the industry was very valuable when I was in public policy because it gave me a perspective that a lot of people don't have. I think a lot of people who get drawn into policy work in Washington, haven't worked in the equity markets, haven't worked in business. Some haven't worked in medicine. I think what gave me more ability to be effective at implementing policy was I had touched all these bases. I had an appreciation for how the equity markets worked. I had an appreciation for some of the issues around industry, having been around the industry. I was a physician, so I was able to talk the medical lexicon, and I had worked in policy. I had prior policy experience, and so that was sort of a formidable set of experiences to help inform what I was doing. And it was very often that I was very conscious of not how equity markets would react in terms of shaping policy, but the sensitivity of the market. So I would talk often about things that we would do that would change flows of capital. I used to talk, and I embedded this in some of Mark's speeches as well. I used to write his speeches, but even when I was making policy, I would think about if we sent signals, I would talk about capital being something that can help advance the public health, and we want to provide clear signals to markets so you get efficient use of capital, and there's public health goals that get achieved by doing that. I talked about that very often when I was at FDA with the professional staff, and the need for us to be sort of consistent and clear and transparent in what we did, because the more that we're sort of not transparent, you get inefficient allocation of capital, which ultimately means that people aren't investing in the things that you think are going to have the greatest public health outcomes. So I talked about that often, and I think that was important. And certainly my experience working on Wall Street gave me that ability. I'd also worked at a long-short investment fund in between my two stints at FDA and in venture capital for a long time, as you know, with that New Enterprise Associate. Right. So I had that experience.
So did you run into any cultural issues? I mean, were there, as you introduced this kind of perspective, which not only was deeply informed by the industry, but as you said, it was kind of center-right libertarian, did you run into people at the FDA who said, why are we even talking about that? That's industry, we're science, we're medicine. Those views shouldn't influence it. What was the reaction to the folks within the FDA when you would raise those kinds of issues about how it might affect the equity markets or how it might affect industry more broadly speaking?
Yeah, well, I mean, I talked about in the context of how it would affect capital allocation, but I always talk, I always talk about it in the context of our shared mission and the public health goals that we were trying to achieve. And I don't think it ever, when you brought these issues into discussions, I don't think it was ever in a way that made people feel it was antithetical to the mission or uncomfortable. I think it was sort of informing with a different perspective, because I think over time, maybe people were skeptical at the outset, but I hope over time people sort of built trust that I cared about the mission of the agency, I was aligned with them, and that we had sort of shared goals in trying to improve public health outcomes and improve the agency's posture with respect to those goals. And so, the idea that, talking about places where we might have been a little bit muddled in guidance and talking about, saying, guys, if we're really clear here in our objectives, we think this is the right way for companies to be developing this product, or we think this is a better opportunity. If we're really sort of clear in guidance about doing this, people are going to we're de-risking it. It's going to be less risky for people to invest there. And so we're going to see more investment. And that was, I think people found that argument attractive. I think they understood that the agency, through where it chose to opine and where it chose to give granular direction and more clarity, could de-risk certain endeavors. And if those were the endeavors that you thought were going to have more public health virtue, that was a good thing to be doing. So I think we got aligned. But again, it was the way you approached the discussion that was important.
You know, I remember many years ago, more than a couple of years ago, when I was covering managed care in the 90s, I remember having a conversation with one of the leading CEOs of one of the leading PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers. And he said to me, I don't know why, you know, we're viewed so hostilely by the drug companies, because we're all after the same thing, which is the right drug to the patient at the right time. And yet he was clearly onto something in identifying a kind of tension, if not outright hostility, between what PBMs were trying to accomplish and what the drug companies were trying to achieve and what they were doing on a day-to-day basis. And I wonder whether you ever ran into any of that kind of tension, or maybe I'll leave it at tension rather than hostility, between what regulators are trying to accomplish and what the industry is trying to do as you moved in, as you went into the FDA in your various positions.
I didn't really see that in FDA. I mean, the FDA, it's a very professional organization, and that has a lot of very clear regulation and guidance governing its work, and a really deep sense of public health mission. I mean, people there really feel, rightfully so, that what the agency is doing is advancing the public health, and it's internalized. People talk about it as part of the esprit de corps of that agency. So there wasn't sort of an implicit hostility to industry. I think that there was a healthy sort of skepticism, and I think the people there really felt that they were watchdogs and they had to ask hard questions and be skeptical. But that was more part of like what they saw as their role and mission. It wasn't just a reflexive, hostility to private industry. I never saw that in the agency. I think there's a view sometimes that, well, the government must be hostile to, or regulators must be hostile to industry. I never saw that at FDA. Never saw any sort of reflexive type of dialogue around that. Look, there were companies, I definitely was in situations where there were companies that were perceived as perpetual bad actors, and there was dialogue around that. But more often than not, there was good rationale for that, or sometimes industry segments that had done things, sort of inappropriate things over time. But I never saw what I would think is sort of just a reflexive antipathy. And oftentimes the skepticism wasn't even in the biggest sort of skepticism that I saw wasn't in the drug context. It was like in the food context. Sometimes with certain food operators where there was, sort of embedded concerns over historical behavior.
In the medical device industry, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that there's been a sea change over the last decade, certainly, a perception that the industry has become much more, I don't want to say friendly, but open to and amenable to the concerns of the industry. But there was a time, a decade or so ago when the medical device industry per se specifically felt that the FDA was harder than it needed to be. And, there's a different regulatory path for medtech. Did you ever sense that on medtech it was a different dynamic than it might have been on the biopharma side?
Not really. And remember, if you accept my sort of thesis that people at FDA are mission driven, have a real sense that the agency's work is advancing public health, how do you advance public health? You advance public health by protecting consumers from things that might not be safe, but you also protect public health or advance public health by bringing to consumers things that are going to improve medical outcomes. Technology can improve medical outcomes. So people were enthusiastic about bringing new innovations, being a participant in bringing new innovations to market. Like the day that we approved, the CAR T, people were really excited about that. The day we approved the Apple Watch, the sort of evolution in technology, people were really enthusiastic about that. And oftentimes what I saw and what I tried to guard against was too much of the focus being on the new, because it was really exciting to work on the new, and forgetting about the sort of old stuff that might seem more mundane, but it's really important, because I think that there was actually, a tendency to focus on the cutting edge and sometimes not put as much sort of focus on developing guidance and clear objectives around things that might seem low tech, but were still very important to advancing public health. And so that was actually the tension that I saw. On the medical device side versus the drug side, I didn't see any difference in sort of the culture of how they approach the work. The medical device framework is much different. And I think that the agency works more closely in certain respects with the medical device industry, because a lot of medical devices are tools in the hands of physicians, and rather than just, you can't really sort of evaluate the medical device apart from how it's going to be used. And so the way the companies are positioning the device, the company's reps and how they're training on the device, all that becomes much more important to the regulatory scrutiny. And so I felt like the regulatory process itself was more intertwined with the activities of the companies than on the drug side, where it was, you just sort of toss the application over the transom and FDA reviews it, by itself.
So right now in Europe, they're undergoing medical device reform, and it's introducing a more stringent oversight of regulatory process. But while you were at the FDA, Europe had a reputation for being an easier place to get products introduced, because the CE mark was in theory easier to get. And so you saw a lot of companies going to Europe first to get products on the market. How was that viewed within the FDA? Did the FDA FDA officials ever feel pressure as a result of an easier path in Europe to get products approved? I mean, as you well know, a lot of companies started introducing products in Europe specifically because they found it an easier path to get to market than the FDA was allowing.
Yeah, I mean, at some point the FDA did feel pressure on the medical device side with companies going to Europe, particularly with the country of origin rules, which force companies to manufacture in the country where the approval happened. And so now you had situations where they were not just commercializing products in Europe, but they were building out manufacturing in Europe or in other markets. And that started to be something that Congress started to take interest in. That happened before I got to FDA. By the time I got to FDA, at least as commissioner, that had already played through politically, and Europe was tightening its regulation. So the whole dynamic was changing. I think there was a time where, going back to like 2005 when I was there as deputy commissioner, I think there was a view that they were getting good data from Europe. So if the product was commercialized first in Europe, that would then become part of the US package, and all of a sudden they'd have a more robust filing. Then you had a period of time where people started to think that there was a device lag, and Josh Macauer's report. But that right. I was outside the agency when that was going on, and then by the time I got to the agency, I think that had played through, and both FDA had started to make some accommodations, and then the Europeans started to tighten the regulation. I think that the risk going into the Meduthma reauthorization is going to be around people who are sort of derisive of the 510K process and the more titrated regulatory process, and think that everything should be a drug, like the drug standard. This is going to be a hard, I think, fight for the industry, because I think people just fundamentally, there's so much orientation around the drug approval process and the idea of prospectively randomized placebo-controlled trials, that when you sort of look at the medical device process, it looks completely different, and people just can't get their head around that. They don't know why that doesn't look the same, without really appreciating that medical devices, again, are tools in the hands of physicians. You can't, and also it's much more iterative innovation, than you see in the medical device space. So that's going to be a hard thing to educate on. I think the industry really needs to spend more time doing that.
So what is your view of it? What is your response to people outside of the FDA, and certainly outside of the medical device industry, maybe other folks in government, in representative government, who argue that the 510K process has become too lax and too easy, and we're not rigorous enough in holding medical device companies to rigorous standards in 510K? Do you tell people that's not really a valid point of view? Do you think there's some validity to that? It's going to be a tough argument for industry, as you know, but how much validity do you think there is to the argument that 510K process needs to be more stringent and with higher standard, more rigorous standard?
Well, look, I think that there are definitely ways to modernize the 510K process, and that's what I focused on. And we ended up putting out a lot of paper on this, sort of our 510K modernization plan. And one thing I talked about a lot is that we need a way to modernize predicates. I mean, the de novo process was clearly intended to do that, but the truth is, there's medical device companies that go shopping for the easiest predicate possible. They get an approval on basis of an easy predicate, and the device is going to be ultimately used in a very different way, or it incorporates features that are introduce more risk than what the predicate does, and it cuts both ways. I mean, devices are also incorporating materials and other innovations that reduce risk, and so by comparing it to an old predicate, you're not taking measure of the reduced risk from the innovation. We were like, the predicate that was used for ultrasound machines was an old ultrasound machine, but new ultrasound machines are, work much differently, offer a much different feature set. So I think that there needs to be a way to modernize the predicates. And I talked about retiring old predicates. That's where I would be focusing. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, just like educating members. When I was there, I made a couple of sort of points about how I operated. I took every opportunity I could get to go testify before Congress. That was very time intensive because I was ultimately testifying on granular issues sometimes that, I didn't have the deep subject matter expertise. I would go and testify on 510K reform. I would go and testify on POPRA reauthorization, the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act. Now, normally you would have sent the center director to do that. I did it, unless the center director wanted to. I mean, if the center director wanted to, and one time, most center directors don't, like Janet Woodcock really wanted to testify on OTC reform, and she did it. She's like, if you do this, I'm going to kill you. So I'm like, you do it, Janet, you testify. But if they didn't want to, I did it. And the reason I did that was because it built relationships with the members. If this members saw me putting myself before them in a sort of public setting, it helped me build better relationships with members. And so I was up every week. I would take an afternoon every week and go up and meet with members off schedule. A lot of people in Washington only meet with members of Congress before they're set to testify. And most people in Washington testify as little as possible. They usually will testify around their agency's budget, and that's it. I testified at least once a month, and I met with members continuously. So I was up there talking about these things because I would go in and there wouldn't be an agenda. It'd be like, what are the 3 things you want to talk about? And most of the time, it was vaping, opioids, and then depending on the member's interest, it could be a 510K, and often it was. And if not, if we were going to be putting something out on it, I would bring it up. So, that's how I approach this. I tried to educate the members. I think that for industry, you can't just do this. What I learned is you can't just go and sort of brief on an issue right before that issue's ripe or when it's become ripe. You've got to be spending like a year talking to people about it and educating people about it. So
how did you find Congress responding to the explanations that you were trying to make, particularly around? I mean, some of the stuff is pretty nuanced, and they're trying to address a whole range of issues. As you'd go up and try to explain something, were members of Congress for the most part amenable to the points you were trying to make? Were they resistant because they had their own prior conceptions about it? What was your reception at Capitol Hill?
Well, it was both. I mean, there were some ingrained views, and members had good reasons for their views. So it wasn't just like ill-informed views. But they were also receptive to to what we were doing and the how we were trying to approach an issue. But again, it was because we were constantly talking to them about it. Like on tobacco, Merkley fundamentally disagreed with what we did. I must have met with him 10 times on tobacco or Durbin. And eventually they started to support what we were doing. They still didn't agree with everything we were doing or not doing, but they understood that we kind of had the same goal and we were just working to achieve it in a different trajectory than obviously what they would have wanted to prescribe. You just had to work at it constantly. So again, for industry on the call, I mean, I would be working at this 2 years in advance of when you're going to try to achieve a legislative change. We were very successful on the Hill, getting new authorities, beating back people who were trying to steal our authorities, getting additional appropriations. I mean, the biggest one-time increase in the FDA's budget was on our watch, and the second biggest was the next year. So we were very successful working with the Hill, but it was because we worked with the Hill. So when things like, the one thing about FDA, and there's a little bit of an aside, but the one thing about FDA is every other agency in the government tries to steal FDA's authority, because FDA exercises a lot of authority and binary authority. There's clear winners and losers with the decisions that FDA makes. So other agencies want to USDA always wanted to steal our food authorities, and they tried to do it with the biotech animals on the way out. Homeland Security, the Defense Department, Pentagon wanted the authority to approve medical products for frontline troops.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember this debate, and it was medical devices and drugs, and they actually got it into the Defense Authorization Act in the House bill, and we ended up getting it stripped out by working directly with the Senate and with members of the House and passing a provision where we offered a sort of alternative to what the Pentagon had gotten in, which was they wanted full rights to approve products for soldiers, and they got it into the bill. They got into the Senate version of the bill initially with Senator McCain's help. And we ended up having a counter provision where we said, we'll give you a high touch service. If you prioritize certain products, we'll basically give those products breakthrough-like designation, because we recognize there's a strategic importance to products that you think are important for frontline soldiers. And we'll meet with you regularly and we'll try to advance these products. And we offered that as a piece of legislation. I had the House, so the Senate passed the bill. So the House had to pass the Pentagon's, the Senate bill, because they couldn't conference it. But then I had the House pass my bill, and then they passed a provision that said that when this bill goes back to the Senate, it can't be considered to have passed the House unless the Senate also passes my sidecar. And my sidecar was a strike and replace. It was a bill to strike the existing language and replace it with my language. We got that done. We beat the sort of Defense Department on this issue. And it was because I must have made 100 calls to members of Congress over the course of like a 2-week period, talking to them about this, educating them about this, and they trusted us, and we had good relationships with members. So we were able to work constructively on legislation like that. That's the sort of important lesson, is you kind of have to do it every day. And on this issue, I would do it every day.
I want to get back to the thing you mentioned about the breakthrough device pathway, but before I do it, was the medical device tax something that the FDA got involved in at all? Was that one of these points of
yeah, and it almost never came up. No, it almost never came up. I really don't remember weighing in on it, and I don't remember anyone asking our perspective on it. We tried to stay in our lane, and I tried to stay in my lane when I would go up. I was constantly getting drawn into debates about drug pricing and Part D stuff, and I tried to stay out of that. Even with the White House, I tried not to take a role in the drug pricing debate beyond just what I did on like generic drugs and trying to promote competition.
So let's go back to the breakthrough device pathway. How do you think it's working, and what benefits do you think it bestows, and benefits for whom precisely?
Yeah, look, I think benefits for everyone. I think it's working well. I like the provision that Medicare came out with. We had been working with them on that to create coverage for devices that had a breakthrough designation. My argument around that was that it would be, if a device that had a breakthrough designation had a sort of guarantee of some basic level of coverage, it would lower the cost of capital for developing that device, right? Merely by conferring that. I said to Medicare, you're going to cover all these devices anyway, or most of them. But if you affirmatively say that in policy, all of a sudden this device becomes something that is, the cost of capital goes down to develop it, because it's got this presumption of coverage. And just by merely changing the policy, you can affect a lot of flow of capital. So this gets back to that first discussion about arguing around markets. And that was, everyone understood that, and SEMA, to her credit, advanced this. There was reluctance in CMS around that policy because the CMS didn't want to sort of give away its right to make a decision and tie it to a decision made by FDA. No agency wants to do that. And effectively what you're doing is just saying the FDA judgment around the breakthrough designation will suffice for our judgment around reasonable and necessary. And just institutionally, no agency wants to do that. But my argument was that the FDA's sort of review of breakthrough is kind of, it's asking the same question. So it's reaching that threshold of reasonable and necessary. And the way we tried to approach it was, well, we'll involve you in that process as well. So, you know, I think that was very important. And I think the breakthrough designation itself and the higher touch from CDRH in the same way it's working on the drug side becomes very important. Now, if the whole world is a breakthrough, all of a sudden the designation loses its meaning. And we're kind of seeing that on the drug side with so many products are becoming breakthrough or getting these special designations that is it really conferring anything special on those products? You don't have that on the medical device side yet, but that's always the tension.
Well, there is in the breakthrough device. I mean, again, you do want that rigor, but it does have the benefit of getting innovative technologies into patient bedside. I don't want to say to the marketplace, but bedside sooner. Was that a winning argument? I mean, you heard, a long time ago that one of the benefits of CE mark was that you got technologies to patients earlier in Germany and France than were available to people in the US. Was that ever a winning argument at the FDA for pushing some of these initiatives maybe more liberally than originally intended?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to make these arguments at FDA, really. I mean, the professional staff was bought into the concept of let's try to advance beneficial innovation. It has to go through an appropriate series of regulatory gates. And so if you had a framework for doing that, there was a will to do it. The arguments I found myself making around, at least on the medical device side, some of these pathways were more externally, where there was, again, skepticism in the Hill among consumer groups that, oh, you're lowering the standard and unsafe products didn't come onto the market. And I think it was important there to explain why it was an appropriate regulatory touch. And some of these products there was an imperative to get it to patients sooner. I think it was a little harder on the medical device side than the drug side, because like everyone could get their hands around why you might approve a product that could help cure Duchenne's muscular dystrophy on the basis of a smaller data set, or something that is highly effective at treating a rare form of cancer. But the medical device realm, you're dealing with different paradigms with each medical device, and so it's a very different clinical story every time, and so it's harder to confer the sort of imperative for a broad class of products or products that meet a certain bar than it is on the drug side. So it was a little harder to make these arguments on the device side. Like if I explained a particular type of LVAD or cardiac pump, okay, they can understand that. But then it was a completely separate story for a different kind of medical device. Where versus on the drug side, it was, well, we have this class of gene therapies that can cure pediatric inherited disorders. Okay, that's a big umbrella. We have drugs that are shrinking tumors in rare cancers. Okay, that's a pretty big umbrella. So it was a little harder on the medical device side from a policy standpoint. And because
more broadly than just breakthrough devices, is there any movement toward a better coordination between reimbursement coverage and device approval, so that companies aren't really kind of fighting two battles consecutively?
Yeah, look, what we did on the breakthrough, and we advanced that, and then I left, and it took a while for it to get out. So I don't know everything that happened in between. I know SEMA championed that and had a lot of religion around the idea. But my view was that was my approach to trying to align coverage with the approval, with this initial market entry, was to kind of say to CMS, look, trust our evaluation. I was skeptical, in all candor, about aligning the two agencies beyond that. Maybe it shows sort of my FDA hat, like, you should cover it because we said it's safe and effective, as opposed to we're going to work with you and bake into the development process all the considerations that you as a payer has. Because I didn't think that the payers had a well-formulated view about what they wanted, had a well-formulated view about clinical development and what was and wasn't obtainable in a reasonable registration trial. And so my fear always was you were going to end up by sort of bringing payers over the wall and having them engaged now in a regulatory process, you were going to end up with a huge expansion of the regulation of what was required to gain market entry. If I felt the payers really had a clear view about how the FDA regulatory process worked and what the trade-offs were in clinical trials, I might have had a different feeling about that. And so that sort of reflects my biases. But I did have that bias. And that was the same reason why people wanted me to be making moves to harmonize to Europe. And I wasn't that eager to try to harmonize our processes to Europe beyond maybe like generic drugs. I thought there should be a global approval process for a generic drug. You can gain simultaneous market entry in the US and Europe because we had very similar processes on generic drugs. And that would have promoted more competition. But I saw the Europeans and Chinese, for that matter, starting to embed in their regulatory processes considerations around budgets, considerations around trying to protect their local industry. So why should I harmonize to the Chinese regulatory process when they're trying to create a protectionist regulatory process? Why should I harmonize to the European regulatory process when they're trying to manage their national budgets by keeping products from coming to the market sooner? So, I didn't want to bring the FDA into force the agency to have to harmonize the processes where the considerations went beyond what our mandate was.
Right, just because they were doing that in China or Europe, why should that mandate or push the FDA to do something that?
Well, we could have, and maybe the US ends up emulating the Europeans, but it shouldn't be baked into the regulatory process, so it's hidden from public view. If people want to stand up and say we're going to sort of slow market entry of an innovation because we don't want to pay for it, I want them to have to stand up and say that. I don't want it to get baked into a regulatory process where people don't see it happening. So
right.
that was my.
Of course, the irony is that a lot of Europeans are now pointing to the FDA as a better, more amenable path, regulatory pathway. So there's going to be a Q&A session. I see some people have already begun to. Let me invite people in the audience to continue to submit questions, and we'll turn to that in just a second. Before we leave this, before we end our session, Scott, let me ask you a couple of questions about COVID specifically, because you've been such a forceful and insightful voice for everybody. But I want to focus a little bit about COVID's impact on the medical device industry. Right now, we're all focused on vaccines and therapeutics, and that's going to come out. Early on, a year ago, not a year ago, but maybe 10 months ago, there was a lot of talk about ventilators and PPE. But I wonder, do you have any kind of thoughts on how the pandemic specifically has affected the medical device industry, separate from biopharma?
Yeah, I think that there's aspects of medical products, medical devices, where there's been a cultural change in the behaviors of consumers or the desires of consumers. One is clearly around the use of technology as a way to deliver care. I don't think we're going back to the way we used to deliver care, where we didn't really incorporate technology. I think we've sort of accelerated an adoption curve, and we've changed the behavior of physicians and patients. Doctors now realize they can deliver care over telehealth. I mean, that's the most obvious. Patients now realize they like getting certain care over telehealth. We have young kids. We're not going back to the pediatrician to look at a rash again. We found out that they can look at rashes over Zoom, and the pediatricians like looking at rashes over Zoom. So I think certain things have just changed. I think the same thing with diagnostics. I think that the idea of bringing diagnostics closer to the consumer and even into the home is now going to be a cultural change. People want to be able to test themselves. And it's not just going to be around COVID. I mean, people now realize, well, why can't I get an answer in myself? Why do I need to go to a doctor so that it gets reported to the public health authority? I don't care about that. I want an answer. And if the test can be reliable, why can't I be trusted with diagnosing myself or getting the diagnosis myself, and be trusted enough to then take it to a doctor, do a responsible thing? And I think that regulators and public health officials were forced to just sort of accommodate that. There was a real paternalism and reluctance. If you had a reportable pathogen or even an infectious disease, how can we let a consumer diagnose themselves? But now the answer is, we don't let them diagnose themselves. They may not get diagnosed. And so, whatever risk you perceive by putting that tool in the hands of consumers, on the whole, you're probably advancing public health. I think that's a cultural change. I think sort of regulators and public health officials got over the paternalism, and consumers now want it. And so it's going to be in flu. It's going to be, I think you'll see a broader selection of diagnostics now moved into the home. So I think that there's been some cultural changes like that and behaviors that we're not going to be going back from.
So I think that's a really interesting way to frame it. I want to get back to that point in just a second, but let me ask you one question before that. The biggest impact on the medical device industry really had to do with the impact of the virus on their customers, hospitals, and particularly the shutdown, near total shutdown, certainly in April of May, of elective procedures. We seem to be coming out of that. But do you have any thoughts on the maybe kind of midterm impact of as we struggle to get out of this pandemic on the provider side of things, and particularly the impact on elective procedures, which has such a material impact on the medtech industry?
Yeah, well, by and large, most elective procedures are continuing through this surge we're having right now, and I don't think we'll have a surge with COVID unless something really unexpected happens with this virus, which I don't expect. I mean, even if you see new variants that are more infectious and you see drift, it's not going to be sudden. I don't think we'll ever have a surge of COVID like we're having now. And even in this surge, the system has learned that it could both hospitalize 130,000 people and continue elective procedures in most parts of the country. I mean, there are exceptions. LA, obviously real intense hotspots. You're seeing hospitals go on diversion and close elective surgeries, but New York isn't. The hospitals are continuing to do elective surgeries as long as they are able to maintain reserve capacity. And now the system's built out more capacity. So I think that we're never going to go back to shutting down all elective surgeries again. And I think that there's going to be a lot of accrued morbidity on the back end of this that's going to have to get worked off. And so you're going to see, I think, a lot of money flow into trying to provide broader coverage and boost coverage for consumers recognizing. You're going to start to see the data come out of like higher rates of cancer diagnoses and heart disease and modeling on some of the accrued morbidity and the price we're going to pay for that on the back end because people have foregone healthcare for a full year. So I think on the back end of this, there's going to be money coming into healthcare and a lot of morbidity to get worked off. So you could see sort of a bolus of activity. What the hospitals were able to create a lot of excess capacity to deal with COVID. What became the shortage now, which we all predicted, was manpower. Because during the first wave of this in New York, the reason why New York didn't collapse, and it almost collapsed the healthcare system, was because of the tremendous amount of manpower that got surged into the city. Well, now every part of the country's lit up, and so nobody can spare nurses. And so now no hospital can dramatically expand their capacity because they just don't have the personnel to do it. My local hospital that I practiced at created 5 ICUs. They can't do that now. They have 2 ICUs going. They can't create the 3 more because they just can't bring the personnel in to staff it.
Right. So I loved your answer about the impact on the medical device industry. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the longer term impact once we're past this. I mean, right now we're kind of focused on when will this surge die down and when can we kind of get back to a normal life. But for instance, I know one COPD company that is anticipating a significant boost in its market because of the long-term impact of COVID on lung. And we're hearing about long-term impacts in the cardiovascular system, pulmonary system, all of which should create some opportunities for medical device coverage. I wonder if you have any thoughts about once we're past the crisis stage of pandemic and we're dealing with the long-term implications of COVID and its impact on patient health, what that might mean for the medical devices, or maybe just for the industry generally.
It's hard for me to, I don't think we really understand what the long-term sequelae of COVID are and the morbidity that COVID itself is going to induce. I mean, there's morbidity that's induced by the people who, didn't get appropriate care over the course of the year, but whether there's long-term implications from COVID, where it's going to be clustered and where we're going to need new medical innovation to try to address it, or we're going to utilize existing innovation more. It's hard to estimate that because it's hard to know what truly is a sort of long-term morbidity associated with COVID. I think where there's COVID-related opportunities in the medical device space is going to be building more resiliency into the system. I mean, diagnostics is clearly one area, but I think that there's going to be more money appropriated for building capacity in the system and the ability to quickly expand capacity. And there's innovations that can help facilitate that. And obviously, like stockpiling respirators is the most obvious, but there's also innovations that help make care more efficient and help extend the utility of providers in an emergency situation. I think that there's going to be a lot of focus on building those capabilities out and building more of a warm base. I mean, on diagnostics, we shouldn't be like building out a whole bunch of machines and mothballing them. What we should be doing is paying LabCorp and Quest a little extra money on every test they run to create more capacity in their existing labs. So instead of running 3,000 machines at 80% capacity, which is maximal efficiency for them, run 5,000 machines at 60% capacity. So you have some surge capacity built in. We do that elsewhere. So one example I come back to is Amgen. After the disaster in Puerto Rico, the hurricane struck Puerto Rico, it knocked fully 10% of all the pharmaceutical manufacturing in the United States offline. So all the 10% of all drugs made or used by U.S. consumers are manufactured in Puerto Rico. So I went down to Puerto Rico to tour the damage, and also before I did that, I called all the CEOs to get an assessment of how much they were knocked offline. They were all knocked offline, and we were literally working with FEMA to get them back online. But I came to Bob Radway, CEO of Amgen, and I called Bob up and I said, Bob, how's your facility? And his facility was away from all the other facilities. It was up in the mountainous region of Puerto Rico. And I never understood why they built it there, but basically he was running, he couldn't get his personnel back because their lives had been turned upside down by the hurricane, but the facility was completely operational. I mean, he had generators to back up his generators and enough fuel on hand to run that place off the grid for a very long time. So I asked him the obvious question, why'd you build such a hardened facility? And his answer was very simple. He said, we made a guarantee to the federal government, and they're paid for this guarantee, that there would never be an interruption in the supply of Neupogen. Neupogen was made in this facility. And Neupogen is a drug that you would use after a radiological attack to help reconstitute bone marrow. So if a dirty bomb went off in the city, you'd need a lot of Neupogen to help save the local population. So the government had paid to have resiliency built in. So what did they do? They built a bunch of hardened facilities and distributed them around the country, and kept them domestic and distributed them around the country. So you could never knock them all offline. They were really hardened, and they kept an inventory on hand as well. So we didn't stockpile Neupogen. What happens is Amgen makes Neupogen, puts it in the warehouse on site, and then ships out the Neupogen that was made 3 months ago. I don't know how long they keep it, but there's always like an inventory there. So there's always a surge inventory. We could do the same thing in the medical device space. I think that's where we're going to go. That's where we should go. Build in resiliency in the critical infrastructure that we need. Don't build a whole bunch of machines and mothball them, because that doesn't work. Look at the stockpile. I mean, the ventilators didn't work. The masks fell apart when they took them out. You have to have the capacity to surge production. That's really what we need, a warm base.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. So I want to turn, I see some questions are coming in. I want to turn this back to Paul and Andrew in just a second, but I wonder if you could just take a minute to reflect on, not that you don't have a long career ahead of you, but, to a certain degree, FDA commissioner is the kind of culmination of this policy interest that you had for a long time. I wonder if you could just reflect on what was the highlight of your tenure? What are you most proud of as FDA commissioner? And were there any kind of unfinished business that you left that you wish you had gotten to, that you didn't quite get to?
Yeah, well, you always leave unfinished business, and there's nothing that I regret not being able to finish, because if you do it right, you leave people in place, right, and you leave stuff on a trajectory that it gets done, and things did get done. I sort of was disappointed in how things went over the last year in terms of the leadership of the agency, but things got done, things got advanced. I think the things I'm most proud of is the places where we changed the perspective of the agency's role with respect to an important public health problem. And the place where I think we did that in my estimation was the most apparent was around opioids, where we really embedded in the culture of the agency that the agency had an affirmative role to play in reducing addiction by rationalizing the prescription of opioids. And we had an obligation to make sure that fewer prescriptions were written, prescriptions were more appropriate, because if we can rationalize prescribing and reduce prescribing only to very appropriate uses, and reduce not just the rate of prescribing, but the duration that these drugs get prescribed for, we would actually reduce the number of people who become addicted to opioids, because there's a certain math element here. A certain percentage of people who get exposed to opioids for a certain duration of time will develop an addiction. And so we had to rationalize that, and that we had a responsibility over the illicit use of these products. My second month on the job, I withdrew Opana ER from the market based entirely on a risk that was associated with the illicit use of that drug, that when you crush that drug up and injected it, it was causing a very untoward side effect. And so we withdrew it just based on that risk. Previously, the agency would have had a view that the illicit use of a drug, the fully illicit use of a drug, not off-label use, but you're actually using it totally illegally, that's not something we would regulate. If someone is going to use a drug in a completely illicit fashion, how could the FDA govern that and even use that in its decision-making? We had a different view. There was people, I didn't get pushback, but it was new ground, and it took time to sort of build that in and get broad consensus. And by the time I left, I felt like it was really part of the ethos and the lexicon of the agency. So I'm proud of places where I feel I sort of positively changed the agency's view with respect to a public health problem, because that's going to be the most enduring. Like if the agency actually changed its own view with how it should approach a problem, that's going to really endure. That's much more durable than getting a guidance out or even getting a regulation implemented.
Yeah, and an incredibly important problem too. Well, I want to echo what we said at the beginning, which is how delighted we are that we had you here, and grateful we are for you to come. And I see there's so many questions. There are a million more I could ask, but Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you to let folks in the audience ask some of the questions.
Yeah, Andrew and I have been looking at the questions. We have many more than we can get in a short period of time. And what we're going to do is read the questions. We'll alternate. And we're looking for questions that where a couple people have asked or might be a new area. So I'm going to start with a question from Kathleen Morrison, who wants to know, going forward, what do you think our FDA priority is going to be in the regulation certification of digital health applications?
Yeah, this was a big area of policymaking, and literally my last week on the job, I got out our blueprint on AI in terms of how we were going to approach AI, because it was really important to me, and I'd worked in it. My chief of staff, Lauren Silvis, who had a lot of expertise in this space, worked very closely with Jeff Shuren in the center on these policies. It was important for us to try to advance these new frameworks. I think that it requires sort of a new model of regulation. We were taking a firm-based approach to how we were looking at a lot of these new tools. So it's going to take like a little bit of a different regulatory model, I think, to create an appropriate framework for lower risk products that nonetheless meet the definition of being a medical device and want to make device-like claims. And ultimately, I think some of this is going to get baked into MDUFMA. But there was a Bakul and the division. I think they were sort of very forward thinking about how they were approaching these products, and getting back to the beginning of our discussion, a real sense that this could transform healthcare and improve access and improve outcomes. And we really wanted to see this field advance. I think we're in early innings. We talk about AI in medicine, but we don't really have true AI in medicine. The AI devices are doing more pattern recognition as opposed to true learning. But I think we'll get there. And the regulatory model was sort of amenable to it.
Great, thanks. Andrew?
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. So bringing you back to COVID, I think I've got one here from Daniel Kraft that I want to read out. And you touched on it just a little bit, so I'd like to see if you can expand it. And then the second part of the question will come from me, and you'll see if you can pick the difference. So Daniel says, thanks for your leadership at the FDA and your key pandemic voice insights. What are your favorite or surprising sources and their longer term implications for healthcare innovation? That's
I lost the question.
Yeah, we didn't hear the middle of that question.
All right. Thank you for your leadership at the FDA and your key pandemic voice and insights. I want to second that. What are your favorite or surprising silver linings from COVID and their longer term implications for healthcare innovation?
I think the question was, what are the silver linings from COVID?
Yes.
Ooh, I mean, I'm not sure that there's anything I could talk about that's too good about the experience that we've been through. I think it's exposed a lot of, frankly, weaknesses in our system. You know, I think that the major lesson I take away is we're far less prepared for a public health event of this magnitude, and far less prepared for a pandemic than we thought we were. I mean, we spent a lot of time in 2006 and 2005 developing a pandemic preparedness plan that was oriented towards flu that we thought should have been more applicable to a coronavirus. But was not. And so I think that we ended up being far less prepared. The international sort of conventions that we had put in place after SARS, the IHR, demonstrated that they don't work, that we're going to need a much different framework internationally to try to get early awareness of these kinds of events. I'm not really sure. I mean, it's an interesting question. I haven't really thought too much about whether there's anything positive that's come out of this experience, other than just the resiliency of the healthcare system. I mean, that is a real positive, that the system is as resilient as it is, that New York was able to surge the way it was. You know, but I think we all thought we had a really good healthcare system in this country. I think this was really demonstrated at the way this is tested, the providers and the system. So that's one silver lining, if you will, that the healthcare system itself.
Scott, were those early preparation plans inadequate, or were they just not followed this time around?
Both. I think that the plans, I think even if the plans had been perfectly executed, we still would have been in a difficult situation, but the plans weren't executed well. I mean, the historic mistake here that I think put us in the position we're in was the inability to field a diagnostic, that we allowed community transmission to get underway in this country. We had no sentinel surveillance. We over-relied on the influenza-like illness surveillance system and syndromic surveillance, which wasn't sensitive for detecting the spread of a coronavirus. And by the time we figured out that it was spreading here, it was widely disseminated, and we were beyond the point that we could use case-based interventions, and we had to go to population mitigation. Then when we went to population mitigation, we still didn't have a diagnostic in place. We still couldn't test. So we had to assume the virus was everywhere, when in retrospect, it wasn't everywhere. It was in New York, it was in Philadelphia, it was in Louisiana, it was in Detroit, it was in Boston. It wasn't in Bozeman, Montana, it wasn't in Houston, and it wasn't in Miami, but we shut the whole country down. And so then when it did get to Miami, and it did get to Bozeman, and it did get to Phoenix, they said, we're not shutting down again. We already shut down. We shut down prematurely. We've had it with shutdowns. And so we're not going to do the mitigation now. So the lack of a simple diagnostic allowed us to get heavily seeded, and then prevented us from being able to target our mitigation. So people got frustrated with the policy response. And, you know, people always point to, well, CDC did, you know, the sort of botched test, and that was a critical flaw. The real critical flaw was an unwillingness by CDC to turn to commercial manufacturers early. There was a real view in that agency, and this goes back to Zika as well, where they bungled the rollout of a Zika test that looks almost eerily exact to what happened with COVID, where they held on to the viral samples, they held on to the sort of right to develop a diagnostic, didn't engage commercial manufacturers who make kits, didn't engage commercial labs. And so when they did stumble, there was no plan B. South Korea engaged commercial labs immediately, engaged commercial kit manufacturers. CDC shouldn't be in the business of developing kits that are going to run on other people's platforms. As some of the people on this phone call know, making a test for your own lab and making a kit that can run in any lab is a much different enterprise. And who makes good kits? Companies who are in labs every day, because you have to build kits with a certain tolerance built in for the fact that every lab runs a little differently. So you can't make a kit that's only going to work in your lab. And knowing how to do that is a skill set that manufacturers have. So we had to turn that over much earlier. We didn't. And that's why we didn't have the diagnostic testing. It wasn't because CDC had problems fielding their tests. That is true. But it's because they didn't engage the commercial manufacturers until, you know, literally 6 weeks later, after much duress. I don't know if that answered your question, but it let me make a policy point, so I appreciate it.
Scott, here's a question in a different zone, your NEA zone. What will it take to incentivize the venture community to support innovation in spaces with significant unmet clinical needs, such as pediatrics and women's healthcare?
Yeah, I think that they're there, and I think they're there in women's healthcare, and I think they're there in pediatrics. You're seeing a lot of investment in certainly pediatric inherited disorders, where I think that there's a real promise of curative therapy. I think the challenge is places where the cost of capital is very high and where you need a huge syndicate to finance development, and where the sort of value creation stage is pushed out further. So, the recipe for killing a sort of segment is raise the cost of capital by making it either the trials really big or increasing the risk, because maybe the guidelines aren't clear, and then push out the value creation stage. So phase 2 data is no longer enough. You need the phase 3 data to actually guarantee market entry. And you're seeing that in certain spaces. I think the place where you're seeing that is in primary care places where the cost of capital is going up and the value creation stage is pushed out much later. So, you end up needing huge syndicates that are going to be in it for a very long time. And how many venture syndicates can finance that?
Great, thanks. I should have mentioned that was a question from Neil Ray. So, Andrew?
Yeah, this one's from Chris Stivers. What would be your top piece of advice for the next FDA commissioner, and any guesses who it will be?
Well, I think it looks like, Janet Woodcock is she's certainly the acting commissioner. And, I know the reporting is she's in the mix to be nominated for the job. I'm not sure I can give Janet too much advice. I think that job is a much more political job than people perceive. And I don't mean political in terms of like the White House trying to, intrude on what you do. I think of political in a much more expansive sense. You're constantly, every member of Congress has a constituent interest with FDA. And as I said, every agency is trying to steal your authorities. So you're constantly, grappling with other agencies and trying to get along and collaborate. You're constantly working with members of Congress. I remember, that 2 days before Thanksgiving, we recalled all the romaine lettuce on the market in the US because there was an outbreak. And we knew that the tainted romaine lettuce was still on store shelves. And so you could literally save lives by recalling the adulterated product. And the first thing I did after the news broke was call Jimmy Panetta, congressman from California, freshman congressman from the Northern California, the Salinas Valley. That was the only region of the country harvesting romaine lettuce at the time. It was going to be one of the farms in his district, to brief him on it, because I knew he was going to get calls from farmers immediately that FDA just destroyed their crop, the economic losses that it imposed, and those are real. And I wanted him to hear it from me. I wanted him to be able to say to his constituents, he talked to me. That you had to constantly be doing that. So it's a very political job. A lot of it is externally facing, and I think people don't fully appreciate that aspect of the job.
Back on COVID, Varun Baraya has a question. How do you think our COVID testing strategy will evolve with the creation of the Pandemic Testing Board and the push toward broad antigen testing? And just where do you think we're going and should be going with testing?
Yeah, I think it's exactly as I said earlier. I think we're going towards, more home-based testing and more testing that's accessible to the consumer. And you're seeing more and more innovation come into the market that is more accurate, is more sensitive and specific, even though you're using an antigen-based test or a self-swab, things like that. So I think that, again, getting to the broader point, I think that there's going to be a bigger push to get tests into the hands of consumers, or a bigger desire of consumers to want tests for things and test themselves more. So a lot of the innovation that's happening may find its way into other diagnostics. And I think we've kind of crossed the line now. And now, regulators and public health officials either embrace it or just accept it. They've admitted defeat and recognize consumers are going to want these tests. But the old approach was, how could you allow a consumer to test themselves for a pathogen that requires some kind of medical intervention or some kind of reporting? I think now we recognize there's more good than harm done from that.
I've got a general one, and this is the question I was going to ask before, is how do you see the trajectory over the next couple of months to year with respect to COVID coming out of this? When can I get out of this bloody room?
Look, I think it's changed because of these new variants. My old belief was, and I had said this on TV, we would peak in sort of first weeks in January, which we had. And in February, March, the virus would really collapse. It is collapsing in some parts of the country. I mean, you're seeing a straight line down in new daily cases, and it would be a really quiet spring and summer. We'd have a really quiet summer. There'd be very little COVID in the summer. We'd vacation, our kids would be in camp. I think the new variants really put a variable in that. You know, what's going to happen potentially is these new variants will gain prevalence right as we're coming down, and instead of coming all the way down, we're going to bounce around. It's not going to shoot back up. We're not going to have a raging epidemic again because there's too much prior infection. We'll be vaccinating. You know, too many people have had it already, but we'll never get to that really low state. Now I'm thinking more that the new variants are likely to be regionalized epidemics. Miami looks hot now. San Diego looks hot now with these new variants. A lot of the positive cases we're getting on the sequencing is coming from those two places. So it might not be a national epidemic we see in the spring and summer. It might be regionalized with these new variants. So, you know, you might still end up in most parts of the country a relatively, you know, easy summer. More people will be vaccinated, but we'll face risk to the fall and the winter. I don't think life is like it is now. I think we go back to work in the fall and the winter, but we're doing it differently because COVID is still circulating, and people who are vulnerable will still be vulnerable and still have to take precautions even if they've been vaccinated. And hopefully we get the vaccination rates up. I mean, I don't know that we get, I think with the vaccine, and I'm on the board of Pfizer, as many people know, I think with the vaccine, the early issue was distribution. We'll solve that. Then you're going to hear the issue is going to be supply. We'll solve that, hopefully, if J&J gets authorized. I think the issue becomes demand. And I think the issue becomes demand sooner than we think. We're behaving like demand here is endless, and there's 300 million Americans who want this. I suspect there may be 150 million Americans who want it, and maybe 120 who will actually go out and get it. And beyond that, we're going to have to work at it to get utilization up higher, because there were 123 million Americans who got vaccinated for flu this year. That's an all-time record. It was a lot of people going out to get the flu vaccine because they were worried about COVID. I think that's your target market, and getting much beyond that may be hard. So we need to start thinking about that now, because we're behaving like demand is endless, and all we have to do is figure out how to ration this. And demand isn't endless here. It's deep, but it's not wide. There's a lot of people who will walk through fire to get vaccinated for COVID. There's a lot of people who really want the vaccine, but it might not be as wide as we think.
Is 120 enough?
No, that's the point. I mean, 120 is about 46% of the population. We probably need to get it higher than that, even especially with the new variants. I mean, 120 might have been enough, combined with 80 to 100 million Americans who have been infected by the end of next month. But with the new variants, the level of prior immunity you need in the population to keep those new variants that are more contagious from spreading is higher. And, against some of these new variants, the vaccine may have reduced effectiveness. I don't think the vaccine is going to be rendered ineffective by the new variants, but you may see a situation where the vaccine isn't providing the same level of protection against some of these new variants. That's just speculation. There's some laboratory evidence right now, but we don't know yet. But that would be the situation. It's not going to be binary where all of a sudden you're going to wake up one day and the vaccine doesn't work. It would be, instead of being 95% effective against this new variant, it's only 70% effective. So therefore, you need to vaccinate more because the vaccine isn't as effective against some of these variants.
Scott, there are a number of people who have just said thank you in the questions, and both for your service and for what's happened tonight. And we need to close up in 1 minute. I was going to lateral over to David. Anything final, David, from your standpoint?
No, I just think this was fascinating. Again, I would repeat what people have done. I mean, this has been such a traumatic experience for so many people on a daily personal basis. And, I think the insight and the role you play as a kind of public spokesman, public commenter on in giving people a sense of what's coming and what's doing, not just in this forum, but, in your numerous television appearances and appearances in print, I think is just an extraordinarily valuable and thing for which we should all be grateful. So appreciate you taking the time, and also for all that you're doing outside of forums like this.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks for having me.